Detroit is a city of great transformations. Over the centuries, it grew from a tiny wooden fort in the wilderness into a mighty industrial city that helped put the world on wheels. It even survived a devastating fire that once burned it to the ground, only to rise from the ashes stronger than before. Now imagine going back in time over 300 years. There are no cars and no skyscrapers, just a great river and endless green forests. In this calm wilderness by the Detroit River, the story of Detroit begins. It's a story of exploration, fire, war, and hope that spans centuries. In this relaxed journey, we'll travel from 1701 to 2025, watching a tiny frontier fort grow into a bustling city. How did Detroit get its motto about rising from ashes? Who were the people that shaped its early destiny? Let's find out together in the soothing tale of Detroit's early history. 1701, the founding of Detroit. Before we begin, kindly let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. And if you enjoy history documentaries like this, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more. It's the summer of 1701, and we find ourselves on the northern shore of a river between two great lakes. The air is warm and filled with the scent of pine trees. Along the riverbank, native peoples like the Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi have lived and camped for generations. They call this river the Strait. In French, the word is détroit. On July 24, 1701, a French expedition arrives by canoe. Leading them is a bold explorer named Antoine de Cadillac. Cadillac steps onto the shore with about 100 settlers and soldiers behind him. He looks around at the strategic spot, a narrow river channel that can be easily defended. Here, he decides, they will build a new settlement for New France. With axes and shovels, they begin to clear the land and raise a wooden palisade. They name the new Fort Pontchartrain, due honoring a French nobleman, Count Pontchartrain, and the strait where it stands. This humble fort, just a cluster of log walls, a few buildings, and a tiny church, is the very beginning of Detroit. Cadillac's plan is ambitious. He wants this fort to secure the fur trade in the Great Lakes region for France. At the time, France and England are rivals, both trying to control North America. By building Fort Detroit, Cadillac hopes to stop the English from moving west and to create a center where French traders and local Native American nations can trade beaver furs and goods. He claims the territory for France, and soon French flags flutter over the walls of the fort. The community is small but determined. French families settle inside and around the fort, planting gardens and hunting in the woods. In the fall of 1701, Cadillac invites nearby Native American tribes to settle close to the fort and be allies. Villages of the Huron, Odawa, and Potawatomi spring up near the French settlement, so that by a few years later, thousands of native people live in the area trading with the French. The fort becomes a multicultural hub of its time. You would hear French voices mingling with many native languages along the river. Life in early Detroit is not easy, but it is vibrant. Soldiers stand guard at the fort's gates. Fur traders paddle canoes filled with pelts. Missionaries teach and learn from the locals, and families try to build a new home in this distant land. An interesting anecdote from these early days is the legend of the Nain Rouge, or Red Dwarf. According to folklore, Cadillac was warned by a fortune teller to beware of a small red impish creature, a spirit said to bring bad luck. One evening, as the story goes, Cadillac encountered a strange little creature with red eyes near the fort. Startled, he drove it away, angering the creature. People later said this red dwarf cursed Cadillac for his harshness. Indeed, Cadillac's own fortunes declined years later. To this day, the legend of the Nain Rouge is a famous Detroit story. Some say the mischievous spirit still appears when the city is about to face hard times. Whether or not the legend is true, it adds a bit of magical lore to Detroit's founding era, making the history feel like a fairy tale in the woods. In reality, Cadillac's Detroit grew slowly. He and his wife, Marie Therese, had a daughter named Marie Therese Cadillac, born at the fort in 1704, the first European child born in Detroit. The settlement was essentially a small village around the fort. Cadillac granted pieces of land along the river to settlers called ribbon farms because they were long, narrow strips reaching the water. In these early years, Detroit's political climate was that of a French colonial outpost. It obeyed the laws of France and was part of the vast territory of New France. Culturally, Detroit was a mix of French customs and Native American traditions. French settlers brought Catholic faith and European farming, while many natives who settled nearby continued their own ways of life and also took up new trades like blacksmithing and carpentry learned from the French. This friendly cooperation didn't always last without problems. There were occasional conflicts, but it set the tone for Detroit as a place where different peoples met and learned from one another. The founding of Detroit in 1701 shaped the future of the region immensely. It established a permanent European presence in an important location. Detroit means the Strait, and for centuries to come, this spot would be a key gateway between lakes, connecting lands and peoples. What do you think would have happened if Cadillac had never built his fort here? Would another city have grown on this riverbank anyway? Or might Detroit not exist as we know it? It's interesting to wonder how history might have changed if that small band of French explorers hadn't stopped at the Detroit River in 1701. For now, our story continues. Detroit survived and grew under the French flag for many years, but that was about to change when empires clashed. Before we jump into the next chapter, just a quick heads up. The visuals in this video add some extra context, but you don't need to watch them to enjoy the stories. So feel free to let this play in the background while you work, chill, or even drift off to sleep with these Detroit facts. Also, if you'd like to help us keep making these videos and get access to exclusive content, plus enjoy everything ad-free, consider supporting us on Patreon. You'll find the link in the description and the comment section below. Alright, let's get back to the stories. 1760. British takeover. By 1760, Detroit had been a French settlement for nearly 60 years. The world around it, however, was caught up in a great struggle between empires. Far away in Europe, France and Great Britain were fighting the 7 Years' War. And in North America, this conflict was called the French and Indian War, because many Native American tribes allied with the French or the British. Detroit, though small, was an important strategic location in this war because controlling Detroit meant controlling access to the Great Lakes and the fur trade. For most of the war, life in Detroit went on quietly. Farmers tended their fields and traders bartered for furs. But everyone knew that the fight between France and Britain would decide their fate. Would Detroit remain French, or would it become British? The answer came in 1760. The British won major victories in this war, capturing French cities like Quebec and Montreal in Canada. With the French losing the war, the remote forts and towns under French control had to surrender. In the fall of 1760, a British force led by Major Robert Rogers arrived at Detroit's fort. Imagine the scene. British red-coated soldiers marching up to the wooden fort that once proudly flew the fleur-de-lis, the French royal flag. The French commanders at Fort Detroit knew they could not resist. the war was effectively over for them. So, without bloodshed, they handed over the fort. The British flag, the Union Jack, was raised over Detroit, and British rule began. Suddenly, Detroit was no longer part of New France. It was now under the King of England's domain. For the people of Detroit, this change brought a new political climate. The French families and farmers didn't leave, they stayed. But now they had to live with British soldiers in charge and follow British colonial laws. The British were generally Protestant and spoke English, unlike the Catholic, French-speaking residents. However, many British fur traders and merchants soon came to Detroit as well, eager to profit from the rich fur trading post. The little community started to have a mix of languages and cultures. You could hear French settlers chatting in their cottages and British officers giving orders at the fort. At first, British rule was relatively mild. They allowed the French residents to continue many of their traditions and even to keep their Catholic religion. But one group was very unhappy with the change: many of the Native American tribes in the region. For years, local Native American nations had strong relationships with the French, who often gave gifts and traded fairly, at least in the natives' view. The British, on the other hand, had a different attitude. They were less inclined to give gifts and sometimes treated native allies more strictly. This led to deep resentment among the tribes. In 1763, only 3 years after the British took over Detroit, a great Native American leader, Chief Pontiac of the Ottawa tribe, decided to resist British rule. Pontiac organized a confederation of several tribes and launched Pontiac's Rebellion. One of the main targets was Fort Detroit. In May 1763, Pontiac and his warriors laid siege to Detroit, meaning they surrounded the fort and tried to capture it. Legend says Pontiac even tried a trick. He came to the fort appearing peaceful, planning to surprise the British. But the British learned of the plan, so Pontiac resorted to a siege that lasted for months. There were battles nearby. One famous fight is the Battle of Bloody Run, where Pontiac's forces ambushed the British outside Detroit. Despite Pontiac's efforts and the long siege, Fort Detroit did not fall. By October 1763, Pontiac's rebellion faded, and the tribes eventually made peace, at least for a time. The siege of Detroit showed how important this little fort was. Native Americans fought fiercely for it, and the British fought hard to keep it. After the conflict, the British realized they needed to be more respectful of the native tribes, and they issued policies like the Proclamation of 1763 to limit colonists encroaching on native lands. For Detroit's residents, the period of 1762-1763 was tense, but life continued. Culturally, Detroit began to slowly change under British influence. English started to be used alongside French, and the styles of clothes and goods in the shops included more British items. Still, Detroit retained a French character for a long time. Many families of French descent stayed prominent in the area for generations. The British control of Detroit lasted for several decades. Even when the American colonies on the East Coast declared independence in 1776 to form the United States, Detroit stayed in British hands because it was far from the main action of the Revolutionary War. It wasn't until 1796, many years after the United States won independence, that Detroit was finally turned over to the Americans as part of a treaty between the US and Great Britain. By that time, Detroit had been British for 36 years. What if the French had never lost Detroit to the British? Would Detroit perhaps have remained a French-speaking city much longer, or even become part of Canada eventually? These twists of history show how the fate of Detroit was tied to global events. The British takeover in 1760 set the stage for Detroit's next chapter as an American city, As the 1800s dawned, Detroit was now under the young United States, and big changes were on the horizon for the growing town. 1805. The Great Fire of Detroit. In 1805, Detroit was a modest frontier town under American control. Imagine a town of narrow dirt streets lined with wooden houses and shops, all enclosed by the old fort's palisade walls. By this time, Detroit had a few hundred residents, farmers, blacksmiths, shopkeepers, and families carving out a life on the edge of the wilderness. Detroit had just become the capital of the new Michigan Territory, a large area that included today's Michigan and beyond. On July 1st, 1805, there was a feeling of optimism in the air. As the territorial capital, Detroit's future looked bright. But on a warm June morning of 1805, disaster struck suddenly. On June 11th, 1805, a fire began in a small stable or barn belonging to a local baker. Legend says the baker knocked hot ashes from his pipe and a spark fell into a pile of hay. Because it had been very dry and windy, the tiny spark quickly grew into flames. The fire spread from the barn to a nearby house, and then to another. Fire, the alarm bell rang out, and people rushed to form bucket brigades, desperately passing buckets of water hand to hand from the river to splash on the flames. Detroit had only one small fire engine, a hand-operated pump, and the wind was whipping the flames faster than anyone could control. House after house built of wood and dried timbers caught fire. Neighbors shouted and children cried as the blaze roared through the town. Within hours, most of Detroit was engulfed in flames. Families grabbed what precious belongings they could carry, a cradle, a Bible, some clothes, and fled outside the town palisades to the river or the fields for safety. The heat was intense and smoke filled the sky. By the time the fire burned itself out, nothing was left of the town inside the fort's walls but ashes and a few blackened chimneys. Astonishingly, only two structures survived. The brick fort Lenault on the hill, which was the military fort just outside the town, and one stone warehouse by the river. Everything else, homes, shops, the church of St. Anne, even the fences, had been reduced to charred ruins. In about 6 hours, the Great Fire of 1805 destroyed nearly the entire town of Detroit. People were shocked and heartbroken. Some wondered if Detroit could ever be rebuilt. A few families were so distraught that they packed up and moved across the river to Canada. The town of Sandwich, now Windsor, Ontario, or 2 other settlements. However, about 2/3 of the residents stayed nearby, refusing to give up on their town. They camped in tents or makeshift shelters, waiting to see what would happen next. It was a dark and uncertain time. All the hard work of generations since Cadillac's landing had literally gone up in smoke. But out of this devastation came a spirit of hope and determination. Just weeks after the fire, important leaders arrived in Detroit. One was William Hull, the newly appointed territorial governor, the same William Hull we will hear about in the War of 1812. Another key figure was Judge Augustus B. Woodward, a friend of President Thomas Jefferson, sent to help govern the Michigan Territory. When Woodward reached Detroit on June 30th, 1805, just 19 days after the fire, he found a smoldering ruin where the town had been. Rather than despair, Judge Woodward saw an opportunity to replan and improve Detroit. He famously said the old city layout was cramped and confusing, and now they could design it anew. Woodward, inspired by the design of Washington, D.C., and the grand ideas of the Enlightenment, drew up a bold plan for Detroit. He imagined broad avenues radiating out from a central grand circle, much like the spokes of a wheel or a hexagon shape. He proposed wide streets and public squares, so that a fire could never sweep through so easily again and the city could grow logically. This vision became known as the Woodward Plan. Not everyone was convinced at first. After all, people were homeless and winter would come in a few months, so they needed houses quickly more than fancy plans. But Woodward promised each family a plot in the new city, if they agreed to wait for the survey and rebuilding according to his map. Most citizens agreed to the plan, hopeful that a better Detroit would rise from the ashes. During this time, Father Gabriel Richard, the kindly priest of Church St. Anne's, gave comfort to the people. He wrote a letter that included a powerful Latin phrase to inspire everyone: Speramus meliora, resurgit cineribus. In English, that means we hope for better things. It will rise from the ashes. This touching motto captured the hearts of Detroit's survivors. It expressed their belief that the city would be reborn better than before. Just like a phoenix, the mythical bird that is reborn from its own ashes. Father Richard's words were later adopted as the official motto of the city of Detroit. Even today, Detroit's city flag bears this Latin motto, reminding everyone of the resilience and optimism of 1805. Rebuilding after the Great Fire was hard work, but it happened surprisingly fast. They laid out new, wider streets. Some of the diagonal avenues from Woodward's plan were only partly done, but you might recognize names like Michigan Avenue, Gratiot Avenue, and Grand River Avenue. Those are from the 1805 plan and still major streets today. The heart of the plan included a large circular park called Grand Circus Park and a main avenue called Woodward Avenue, named after Judge Woodward himself. In the years following the fire, Detroit rose again. New houses and shops were constructed, this time with more brick and stone to resist future fires. By about 1819, just 14 years later, Detroit's population had doubled and the city was bustling once more. New industries popped up, like fisheries, lumber mills, textile production, and even breweries. Steamboats began to visit Detroit's harbor after 1818, carrying passengers and goods on the Great Lakes and making Detroit less isolated. The Great Fire, while devastating, ended up transforming Detroit for the better. It gave the city a chance to rebuild in a planned way and brought its people together with a shared spirit of determination and hope. What do you think Detroit's future would have looked like if the Great Fire of 1805 had never happened? Would the city have kept its old layout of narrow streets, possibly facing more fires? Perhaps Detroit wouldn't have its famous motto about rising from the ashes. Sometimes, out of a disaster, a community finds a new strength and identity. In Detroit's case, the fire of 1805 became a defining moment, teaching the city to always hope for better things and to come back stronger. With Detroit rebuilt and hopeful, one might think the worst was over. But a few years later, the people of Detroit would face another severe test. This time, not from nature, but from war. 1812. War and the surrender of Detroit. The year is 1812, and the United States has declared war on Great Britain. This conflict, known as the War of 1812, happens just a few decades after American independence. It's fueled by various disputes. The British are interfering with American ships at sea and supporting Native American resistance on the frontier. For Detroit, this war is very personal. The town sits right across the river from British Canada. If war breaks out, Detroit will surely be a target. By this time, Detroit's population is still small, under 1,000 people, but it's the key American post in the northwest frontier. The political climate is tense. Many in Detroit are anxious. remembering how the British held the town before 1796. Now the British, in Canada, along with their Native American allies, might try to take Detroit again. In the summer of 1812, Detroit is commanded by General William Hull, the territorial governor, the same man who helped rebuild the city after the fire. He's an aging Revolutionary War veteran, and he has a few thousand American militia and soldiers under his charge to defend Michigan. Across the river, British General Isaac Brock is preparing to attack, and he's joined by the famed Shawnee Chief Tecumseh, who leads a confederation of Native American warriors. By August 1812, the British and native forces move toward Detroit. The residents can see British cannon being set up on the Canadian side of the river, aimed right at them. General Hull faces a terrible dilemma. He fears that if he fights and loses, not only will his soldiers die, but the entire town, including women and children, could be harmed by a battle or by angry warriors. Hull remembers tales, some exaggerated, of harsh treatment in frontier wars and is terrified of a massacre if the fort is overrun. On August 16, 1812, without a single shot being fired in the streets of Detroit, General Hull makes a stunning decision. He surrenders Fort Detroit to the British. He raises a white flag and agrees to give up the fort, the town, and his army. People are astonished. Detroit has more than 2,000 American troops, while the attacking British force is actually smaller, though Hull didn't know that for sure. General Brock and Chief Tecumseh used clever tricks to intimidate Hull. They marched their native warriors around and around in the woods to make it seem like there were countless fighters. They sent Hull a threatening message, implying that if he didn't surrender, they would not be able to control the native allies' fury, hinting that the native warriors might massacre everyone. Believing himself outnumbered and wanting to save Detroit's civilians from violence, Hull lost his nerve. So he handed Detroit back to the British without a fight. Imagine the mixed feelings in the town on that day. Some American soldiers and officers were angry and felt humiliated. They had given up without using their weapons. Many townspeople were frightened. Suddenly, the flag they lived under changed in an instant. One day they were Americans. The next day the British were in charge again. British troops marched into the fort and took control. Chief Tecumseh and his warriors walked through the streets. Though there was no violence now, just the uneasy quiet of a conquered town. For the British, it was a great victory and a huge morale boost early in the war. For the Americans, it was a shocking defeat. Back in the eastern United States, people were outraged with General Hull. He was later court-martialed, put on trial by the army, and sentenced to death for cowardice. President Madison felt sorry for the old man and spared his life, but Hull's reputation was ruined. Detroit's surrender in 1812 could have changed the course of its history dramatically. Had the British managed to hold Detroit until the war's end, perhaps it might have become part of Canada. However, the war was far from over. In September 1813, 1 year later, American forces won a crucial naval battle on Lake Erie, led by Captain Oliver Hazard Perry. With control of Lake Erie, the British supply lines were cut off. The British Army and their native allies had to abandon Detroit. American General William Henry Harrison marched north and reoccupied the town. The US flag was raised once more over Detroit, and it has never left since. The British defeat at the Battle of the Thames in Ontario, where Tecumseh was killed, further ensured Detroit would stay American. By the end of the War of 1812, which concluded in 1815 with a peace treaty, Detroit was securely part of the United States again. The War of 1812 and Hull's surrender left a deep impression on Detroit's people. It taught the young United States an important lesson about defending the frontier. After regaining Detroit, Americans strengthened their forts and were more cautious. Culturally, the brief return of British rule in 1812 didn't last long enough to change Detroit much. But it reminded everyone of how vulnerable they were on the border. In the years after 1815, Detroit began to grow in peace. American settlers started coming in greater numbers to Michigan, especially after the war when it felt safer. Detroit evolved from a frontier fort into a small city with businesses, schools, and a diverse population. French descendants, British Americans, and others. What do you think would have happened if General Hull had refused to surrender and fought instead? It's possible Detroit might have been damaged or many lives lost in battle. Or perhaps Hull could have held out until reinforcements came. History took the path of a quick surrender, a decision still debated by historians. But fortunately, Detroit's setback was temporary. The city would remain American, free to develop under the young nation's flag. 1817, the first university in Detroit. After the War of 1812, Detroit and the Michigan Territory experienced a time of renewal. New settlers arrived, businesses reopened, and there was a spirit of progress. The leaders of the community believed that knowledge and education were key to a better future. Even on the frontier, far from the older colleges of the East Coast, Detroit's people wanted their children to learn about the world. So, in 1817, just 2 years after the war, Detroit became the birthplace of a pioneering educational institution. It was originally given a very grand, tongue-twisting name, the Catholepistimiad of Michigan. Don't worry, even people back then had trouble with that name. Catholepistimiad was a fancy made-up word combining Greek roots meaning universal knowledge. In simpler terms, it meant a school of universal learning. This school, established in Detroit in 1817, would later become the University of Michigan, one of the first public universities in the United States. How did this come about? Remember Judge Augustus B. Woodward, the man with big ideas who helped rebuild Detroit after the fire? He played a major role. Judge Woodward, along with Father Gabriel Richard, the beloved priest and community leader, and several other visionaries, believed that the frontier town should have an institution of higher learning, just like older cities did. They were influenced by the Enlightenment ideals, the idea that education and science make society better. Together, they persuaded the territorial government to create this new school. On August 26, 1817, the Catholepistimiad was formally founded by an act of the Michigan Territorial Legislature. They set up the school in a modest building in Detroit at the corner of Bates and Congress Streets. Just a small white wooden structure, nothing like a big university campus you might imagine. The first teachers included Reverend John Monteith, who was a Protestant minister, and Father Gabriel Richard, who was a Catholic priest, showing a spirit of cooperation across religions for the sake of education. In fact, John Monteith became the first president of the school, and Gabriel Richard was vice president. They offered instruction in a wide range of subjects reflecting that universal knowledge idea. But at first, it likely functioned at a basic level, teaching local children reading, writing, and perhaps some classical languages or sciences. For the people of Detroit, the founding of this school was a huge cultural milestone. Think about it. Detroit was still largely a frontier town with log cabins, dirt roads, and a population that included farmers and fur traders. Establishing a university in such a place was a statement of faith in the future. It said, "We believe this place will grow and we want it to have learning and culture." Families were proud that their children might get a quality education without traveling far away. Politically, It also made the case that Michigan was ready for more self-governance and advancement, which feeds into the coming statehood. The Catholipistemude's name was cumbersome, and in 1821 it was simplified to University of Michigan. For the first 20 years, this university in Detroit was small. Some say it was more like a preparatory school or high school, but it laid the groundwork for an educational system. In 1837, the University of Michigan would be moved to a new location in Ann Arbor, a smaller town 45 miles west of Detroit, and eventually blossom into the great university we know today. But it all started in Detroit with that little 1817 school. We can imagine a scene in 1817, a group of students, mostly boys in that era, and maybe a few girls at lower levels, sitting on wooden benches in a simple classroom, learning their Latin or arithmetic, while outside the window the muddy streets of Detroit bustle with wagons. Perhaps a Native American child and a settler's child sat together learning their ABCs. Father Richard had earlier started a school for both native and settler children. This emphasis on learning helped shape Detroit's culture, making it not just a military or trading outpost, but a place of ideas and knowledge. Over time, many lawyers, doctors, and leaders would be educated through institutions that sprang from this first school. The political climate at the time was supportive of such progress. The territorial Governor Lewis Cass, who succeeded Hull, was also forward-thinking and helped negotiate land treaties that allowed more settlers, though often at great cost to native tribes, land. The presence of a newspaper. The Detroit Gazette started in 1817 as well, and a university showed Detroit was becoming a true American town with civil society, not just a frontier fort. Though small at first, the university in Detroit would have a big impact on Michigan's future. It signaled that Michigan's people valued education and were preparing their youth to lead and innovate. Indeed, future legislators, teachers, and even governors would have connections to that early University of Michigania. And it's a point of pride today that Detroit was the first home of the University of Michigan, one of the top universities in the country. This mix of practical frontier life with big dreams of learning characterizes Detroit's spirit in the early 19th century. The city was gearing up for the next big step, Michigan's statehood. As the 1830s approached, Detroit had schools, churches, newspapers, and growing commerce. The population of the territory was booming as more pioneers moved in. The people were ready to join the Union as a full-fledged state, with Detroit leading the way. 1920, Detroit's rise as a major city. By the year 1920, Detroit had transformed dramatically. Once a small frontier town, it was now the fourth largest city in America. Imagine a lively metropolis with a population soaring above 1 million people. Streets hummed with activity cars, streetcars, bicycles, and pedestrians all sharing the busy roads. Detroit had grown largely because of its booming automotive industry, led by giants like Henry Ford, whose factories attracted tens of thousands of workers from across the United States and around the globe. Detroit had become the ultimate city of dreams. Workers, both skilled and unskilled, poured into neighborhoods like Corktown, Poletown, Hamtramck, and Mexican Town, each district reflecting the cultures of those who had come to find their fortune. Many African Americans moved north during the Great Migration, seeking escape from poverty and racial violence in the South. Detroit promised jobs, better wages, and hope for a brighter future. But the city was growing so quickly that it struggled to keep up with the influx of new residents. Houses popped up overnight, creating neighborhoods filled with modest homes, boarding houses, and crowded apartments. Public transportation expanded, and Detroit began building new schools, libraries, and parks to accommodate families. The city was thriving, but beneath the surface, tensions simmered. Competition for jobs sometimes sparked conflicts between new arrivals and longtime residents, foreshadowing deeper challenges ahead. Imagine if Detroit hadn't grown so quickly. How might the city's culture have been different without this massive influx of people from diverse backgrounds? 1929. The Ambassador Bridge connects to nations. Amid Detroit's explosive growth, the city found itself needing stronger connections, not just within its own neighborhoods, but across borders as well. By the late 1920s, Detroit and its Canadian neighbor, Windsor, Ontario, envisioned a bold solution, building the Ambassador Bridge, a grand suspension bridge that would become an iconic symbol of unity between the United States and Canada. On November 15, 1929, the Ambassador Bridge officially opened. Picture crowds lining the banks of the Detroit River, cheering as cars and trucks rolled over the longest suspension bridge in the world at that time. The bridge symbolized prosperity and international friendship, allowing easier travel and trade. Goods moved freely across the border, cars, steel, and countless manufactured products, boosting Detroit's economy further and making the city an international hub of commerce. However, shortly after the bridge opened, disaster struck the nation. The Great Depression of 1929 plunged Detroit, like the rest of America, into deep economic despair. Factories slowed production, many people lost their jobs, and lines stretched around city blocks at soup kitchens. Yet, despite these struggles, the Ambassador Bridge stood stronger, lasting reminder of Detroit's spirit and resilience during hard times. What if the Ambassador Bridge had never been built? How would Detroit's economic landscape have changed without such an easy international connection? 1943, the Detroit race riot and deepening racial tensions. By the time America entered World War II in 1941, Detroit once again became a symbol of industrial strength. Factories roared back to life, producing tanks, airplanes, and jeeps to support the war effort. Workers both black and white moved to Detroit for these new job opportunities, making the city overcrowded again. But with this growth came renewed tensions. On June 20th, 1943, racial frustrations boiled over into violence, known as the Detroit Race Riot of 1943. This terrible event began as a small conflict between black and white youth near Belle Isle, a popular recreation area. Rumors quickly spread across the city, and within hours, violence erupted. Crowds spilled onto the streets, smashing windows, overturning cars, and fighting viciously. The riot lasted 3 days, resulting in 34 deaths and hundreds of injuries. African American neighborhoods bore the brunt of the violence. The riot shocked America, highlighting the depth of racial divisions, even as the country fought fascism overseas. In the aftermath, Detroit faced a harsh reality. Racial harmony was still distant. Yet, amid sorrow and anger, activists and community leaders began pushing for change, planting the seeds for future civil rights efforts. How might Detroit have evolved differently if these racial tensions had been addressed earlier, before violence erupted in 1943? 1959, the birth of Motown, a new cultural legacy. Despite its struggles, Detroit remained a city of innovation, especially in music. In 1959, a young visionary named Berry Gordy Jr. founded a small record company in a house on West Grand Boulevard. He named it Motown Records, combining motor and town, a tribute to Detroit's automotive roots. Motown quickly changed music history forever. Talented young artists like Smokey Robinson, Diana Ross, Stevie Wonder, Marvin Gaye, and the Temptations walked through Motown's doors and emerged as legends. Imagine Detroit streets pulsing with vibrant music spilling from car radios, homes, and dancehall songs like My Girl, Stop, In the Name of Love, and Dancing in the Street. More than just entertainment, Motown broke racial barriers. Its stars became cultural ambassadors, crossing racial divides and bringing black music into mainstream America. Gordy's vision helped pave the way for broader acceptance of African American culture, giving Detroit a proud new identity. Motown, the city of soulful rhythms and unforgettable melodies. What would Detroit's identity be today if Motown Records had never existed? How much did music shape the soul of this city? 1967, the 12th Street Riot and Detroit's turning point. Even as Motown filled America's airwaves with joyful sounds, Detroit's deep racial and economic tensions remained unresolved. Poverty, discrimination, and frustration simmered beneath the city's cheerful facade, especially in predominantly black neighborhoods. These tensions exploded dramatically on July 23, 1967, during a police raid on an illegal after-hours bar on 12th Street. The raid quickly escalated into widespread anger and violence. Thousands took to the streets, rioting, looting, and clashing with police. The 12th Street riot became one of the most severe urban riots in American history. The violence lasted 5 days, resulting in 43 deaths, hundreds of injuries, and thousands of buildings burned or damaged. Federal troops were called in to restore order, and the images of Detroit in flames were broadcast worldwide. The riot became a tragic turning point, accelerating white flight from Detroit. As many residents moved to suburbs seeking safety, businesses left, neighborhoods emptied, and Detroit's economic and social decline intensified. The riots starkly revealed deep inequalities and ultimately reshaped the city's demographics for decades. Could Detroit's decline have been prevented if racial and economic inequalities had been addressed sooner? 1973, Coleman Young, Detroit's first black mayor. After years of struggle, Detroit was desperate for change. In 1973, voters elected Coleman Young as the city's first African-American mayor. Young, a fiery advocate for racial justice and equality, symbolized hope for Detroit's marginalized communities. As mayor, Young faced enormous challenges: crumbling infrastructure, racial divisions, economic troubles, and the urgent need to heal wounds left by riots. Yet he tackled these head-on, tirelessly advocating for Detroit's residents. Under his leadership, the city worked to rebuild neighborhoods, encourage minority-owned businesses, and fight discrimination. Though controversial at times, Mayor Young left a lasting impact. He fought passionately for the city he loved, helping Detroit regain some pride and dignity after difficult decades. His two-decade leadership showed Detroit's resilience and determination to rise again, even in the toughest times. How might Detroit's trajectory have differed without Coleman Young's groundbreaking leadership? Could another leader have unified the city during such challenging times? 2008, political scandal, and Mayor Kilpatrick's resignation. By the early 2000s, Detroit faced immense challenges. Economic hardship and population decline had taken their toll, and the city was struggling to maintain essential services and infrastructure. Yet, amidst these problems, a charismatic young leader emerged, offering hope: Kwame Kilpatrick. Elected mayor in 2001 at just 31 years old, Kilpatrick seemed like a breath of fresh air. He promised to revitalize neighborhoods, bring jobs back, and restore Detroit's pride. At first, His vibrant personality and vision energized the city, but beneath the surface, trouble brewed. In 2008, scandal rocked Detroit. Mayor Kilpatrick faced accusations of corruption, abuse of power, and obstruction of justice. The scandal revolved around secret text messages revealing he lied under oath about an extramarital affair and misconduct. The city was stunned as the charismatic mayor's once promising career unraveled. Under intense pressure and mounting evidence, Kilpatrick resigned in September 2008, later serving prison time for his crimes. Detroit's citizens felt betrayed, and trust in city leadership was badly damaged. Kilpatrick's downfall deepened Detroit's political and financial crisis, setting the stage for even tougher challenges ahead. How different might Detroit's recovery have been if Kilpatrick had fulfilled his initial promises? Could stronger leadership have prevented the city's eventual bankruptcy? 2013. Detroit files for bankruptcy, a city at its lowest point. By 2013, Detroit had reached a crisis point. Decades of population decline, unemployment, mismanagement, and corruption left the city buried beneath billions of dollars in debt. Essential services like police, fire departments, and street lighting barely functioned in some neighborhoods. Once grand buildings stood abandoned, and entire city blocks lay in ruin. Detroiters faced uncertainty and despair. On July 18, 2013, Detroit officially filed for bankruptcy, the largest municipal bankruptcy in US history. Imagine the nation watching closely, shocked to see an iconic American city declare it could no longer pay its bills. Headlines worldwide declared Detroit's downfall, symbolizing economic decline and urban decay. Yet, in this darkest moment, Detroit's spirit refused to break. Citizens rallied, determined to rebuild their city. Bankruptcy forced painful decisions, but also cleared the way for change. Debts were restructured, resources redirected, and city leaders and residents joined forces, determined never to let Detroit fall this far again. Could bankruptcy, though painful, have been the necessary catalyst to save Detroit? Was this Detroit's turning point toward genuine rebirth? 2014. Mayor Mike Duggan and the beginning of Detroit's revival. In the wake of bankruptcy, Detroit needed a fresh start. In 2014, voters chose a new mayor, Mike Duggan. Duggan was the first white mayor of Detroit since the early 1970s. Elected by a majority black city, a sign of voters prioritizing change and progress over race or politics. Duggan's message was clear. It was time for unity, hard work, and rebuilding from the ground up. Mayor Duggan quickly got to work. He prioritized restoring basic city services, streetlights, public safety, garbage pickup, and revitalizing neighborhoods block by block. His administration attracted new investments, businesses, and residents to the city. Projects aimed at revitalizing downtown Detroit began to show results, turning abandoned buildings into thriving spaces filled with shops, offices, and apartments. Slowly, life returned to neighborhoods previously written off as lost. Young people, entrepreneurs, artists, and professionals came back to Detroit, drawn by affordable housing and the excitement of participating in a comeback story. Though challenges remained, Detroit was clearly beginning to rise again, fueled by hope, determination, and community spirit. Would Detroit's resurgence have happened without Duggan's leadership, or was the revival simply inevitable because of the resilience of Detroit's people? 2025. Detroit's Resurgence, Michigan Central Station, and the tech boom. Fast forward to 2025, and Detroit's renewal is more visible than ever. The city known for cars and music now has a new identity, innovation, and renewal. Perhaps nothing symbolizes this more clearly than the restored Michigan Central Station. Once abandoned and now a vibrant hub for tech and innovation, reclaimed by none other than Ford Motor Company. Imagine the iconic Michigan Central Station, once a symbol of urban decay, now buzzing with life. Tech startups, engineers, artists, and innovators collaborate in bright, modern spaces, creating new ideas that will shape the future. Autonomous vehicles, renewable energy solutions, and advanced technologies all find their home here. Rooted in Detroit's proud tradition of innovation, neighborhoods once forgotten now bloom again with new businesses, parks, and galleries. Detroit's downtown bustles with energy, reflecting diversity, creativity, and optimism. The scars of past struggles are not erased, but they are embraced, proudly worn as reminders of resilience, strength, and renewal. Detroit in 2025 is proof that even after falling to its lowest point, a city can rise again. It stands as a symbol of hope, not just for its residents, but for all American cities facing similar challenges. Looking ahead, what does Detroit's journey teach us about resilience and renewal? Can other struggling cities find inspiration in Detroit's remarkable comeback? As we reach this point in Detroit's incredible history, let's reflect for a moment. Detroit's journey from frontier fort to international industrial powerhouse, from deep struggles to inspiring revival, has been extraordinary. Throughout these centuries, the city has continuously reinvented itself, proving time and again that it has the courage and strength to overcome challenges. Detroit's story reminds us that cities aren't just buildings or roads. They are people, dreams, creativity, and community. And when those people come together with hope, even the greatest obstacles can be transformed into powerful opportunities for renewal. Take a deep breath, relax, and reflect on Detroit's journey so far. Its story is far from over. Please let us know what you learned from the entire history of Detroit, and share with us the country you're watching it from in the comments section below. And it would mean the world to us if you could like, subscribe, and share this video to your loved ones. Thank you everyone for watching. Sleep tight.